Hi, I'm Tom Zimmerman from the EMDR podcast. This is a special guest interview with Dr. Jamie Marich from the Institute for Creative Mindfulness about their forthcoming book, Dissociation Made Simple, comes out in January of 2023. Thanks for joining. Welcome. We have been friends for a while now, and I've seen many different projects, many different books come into existence. It seems like this one's special. It seems like this one has a very special place, not just in your attention, but in your time and in your energy and in your enthusiasm. Am I picking up on something here?
Yes, you most definitely are. And it's especially special because you're one of the contributors in it.
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned friendship because I'm grateful for the relationship we do have, which is that you started as a student, but found that we had a lot of common paths, and then we became friends, and you work and do trainings and consultation and assisting in my group. And you're one of the people who I've met in my world who really gets and understands dissociation. And yes, this project is special because I want it to be a project where those of us are speaking from the voices of lived experience about it and not just trying to show what we know as EMDR therapists or as clinicians, because I think the way dissociation has been discussed in the EMDR community and in larger psychotherapy, something's been gravely missing. And so, yes, this project is very personal for me. It's the most personal book I've written while still hopefully trying to educate. And I'm glad so many of you have joined me in the journey.
Awesome. Thank you. What are you hoping that therapists particularly, right? Because this book has a pretty broad audience.
It does.
What are you hoping that therapists particularly are going to get, right? What's going to be the kind of core take home for therapists, particularly, ideally, people who are already identify themselves as trauma therapists. So even that specific audience, what are they going to get, hopefully?
An insight into how personal this is, even for them, whether they realize it or not. You and many people who follow my work know that a thread of my teaching is to truly understand dissociation in your clients. You have to first understand it in yourself. Not dissimilar to what we teach about if you're going to take a client through trauma work, you have to engage in some form of it yourself, I think, to really do it well. But I see dissociation, even amongst trauma therapists, I've seen it over there as being talked about as this thing we should avoid at all costs. It's a dirty word. It's something that has to be steered away from if we're going to do good EMDR therapy. And there's even people who identify as trauma therapists who tell DID folks that I've met, I don't know if I feel okay about doing this with you because of your dissociative identities. And I want trauma therapists especially to, yes, really have their whole relationship with the word dissociation changed into something that is a very normal part of the human experience. And for us to consider that maybe the reason we've been so afraid of it is that we've been so afraid of our own. So this is not the kind of book that you're going to pick up and learn how to work with dissociation in 10 easy steps. I don't write that way. I don't teach that way. I realize some people feel they need that in order to learn, but the kind of teaching I do really tries to invite people into having a more personal experience.
Okay, excellent. And as you talk about fear, that's something that I've been thinking about related to dissociation. I don't think phobia is a bad word to describe therapist relationship with
My first
with
major on it, the way I titled it was Encountering Our Dissociation Phobia. Because yes,
yeah.
I mentioned in that article that we have Islamophobia, homophobia, all of these horrible constructs that are now getting discussed in society. And yes, therapists, more than any people that I think I've met, are can be dissociation phobic. So yeah,
Okay.
that's what I directly use.
And I know this is a little on the spot, but why? What are your kind of working theories about why? Why would therapists of all people be so phobic of?
Well, the larger, more philosophical answer, and then I'll get to something that's a little more practical, is once more fear of our own dissociation, fear of our own trauma. And whenever there is this hesitancy I think in the field at large about, you and I've talked about this, I don't do trauma work. I
Hmm.
don't do this. There's this fear of affect that can go along with it. This wall, this avoidance, this dissociation, that we put up from having not really encountered our own relationship with it ourselves. So that's the larger part of it, is it's our larger phobia as a society, as a field, about trauma. And really, I think realizing that when we hold people accountable for trauma, even our field, it can create a rub. It can create,
Hmm.
something that's a little uncomfortable. But I think, the other big part of where this phobia comes from has to do with the media stigma about dissociation, that DID, especially dissociative identity disorder, can get portrayed as this dramatic thing that is equated with violence and acting out. And it still amazes me, and I know you and I have seen this in some of the EMDR groups, how many therapists are getting their dissociation education from movies like Split or Sybil, even,
Hmm.
that have
Right.
largely been condemned as either, if not fabricated, totally sensationalistic. And I think a lot of that fear of dissociation is this fear of violence that we've seen in this portrayal. I have a line in the book that we have to get rid of this association, that dissociation equals violence. And a lot of that is media fed. And I think a lot of it is, this is continuing on more of the practical end, is this quote unquote fear that I won't be able to bring them back, fear that I'm going to do more damage. So many dissociative folks I've worked with over the years have been told things like that by therapists. You can't do EMDR because it could permanently damage you more than you already are. And I won't even go into yet what clients hear when they hear something like that. But
Right.
I think there's this fear of creating more harm. And inevitably, I hear that fear the most from people who've not yet come to terms with just how much they've dissociated in their lives, and how much unhealed trauma and unexpressed affect may be a factor for them.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Um, I don't know how much you want to get into this, so I'll just throw this out as an idea. But many of the models, that are professional models for dissociation in the last 30 years, do start in a kind of okay place. They do kind of normalize parts. They, embrace models that kind of are somewhat compatible with many of the things that, but if you look at them carefully, and some of my clients have said this, there's a dogma in many of them that almost replaces one dogma for another. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
A lot of thoughts about that, and good on your clients for recognizing that. I mean, I
Right.
think whenever you get into model or approach to therapy or founderism, these are things we've talked about off this,
Mm-hmm.
and there runs the risk for dogma, for sure. And so yes, good on your clients for recognizing that. And some of the models, and I never mind mentioning IFS by name when we have this conversation, because I think it is a model that fundamentally has a lot of good components to it and a lot of good threads to it. Yet where I have criticized it is really twofold. On one hand, there's such this normalization that we all have parts, which I'm on board with. And I'm glad that that is put out there in this idea that all parts are welcome. But hanging out with the DID and dissociative disorders community, like I do, there is this feeling that a lot of our voices have gotten excluded in those discussions, and that anything that is a neat, clean model, even neat, clean models that can allow for some variation, kind of go against what the dissociative mind really is, which is it's not neat, it's messy, it's
Mm-hmm.
chaotic, it's qualitative. And I always say the best parts model we can come up with is the one the client teaches you themselves on how to best understand their internal world. Something we call out in the book is how Frank Anderson, who is a senior trainer in the IFS method, in his book from 2021, calls people with dissociative disorders, DID especially, masters of deception. And yeah, that has activated a lot of people in the DID community. And there's another book that I cite by Jordan Fadman and James Gruber called Your Symphony of Selves, which is another one of these beautiful, oh, we all have parts, embrace your internal world, your internal symphony. But they spend so much time in that book really assuring people, you don't have DID, and very much othering us in this attempt
Hmm.
to try to normalize so much of the parts world. So yeah, when people ask me what's your favorite model for working with parts and dissociation, my simple answer is I draw some cool things for all of them, from all of them, but I think they all have problems too. So fundamentally, the best model you can use is, yeah, you could have the learnings that you've gotten from your training, but let the client teach you how to best work with them.
Okay, good. In addition to what readers are going to find in the book about all of the, dozens and dozens of people that you talk to about their dissociative experiences, can you tell us a little bit about the community you were just talking about, right? So I hear in the infinite mind, I hear, that there is this, it's almost, I mean, I don't know if I want to use identity. Is identity the correct word? I mean, it's almost the politics of identity, because what we're talking about is um, core aspects of personhood not
Yeah.
being seen.
And one of the terms I like that's coming into wider use, and I've recently started adopting it for myself, is dissociative identities. In that, I do not have a full DID diagnosis.
Mhm.
My technical diagnosis is OSDD type 1, which is the closest thing to DID without having it.
Mhm.
But I have a very clear identified part system. And so that's where I feel a lot of solidarity with people with the DID diagnosis. A lot of people are using dissociative identities because they don't like the word disorder on it.
Right.
Uh, so dissociative identities is becoming a nice catch-all for those of us who really do identify as having a clear and distinguished part system and the way we navigate life without putting the terminology of disorder on it. So I think identity is a fine word to use. And how I interestingly even became, and I think it was a wonderful process of discovering, wow, there were other therapists and people like me out there. And I started to realize there was something to it when it was probably around 2014. I was giving a talk. It was just kind of a trauma 101 talk when I was out on the national circuit. And I had mentioned, I'd already started mentioning at that fact that dissociation was a big part of my trauma struggle. That was a lot of the language I used. And I think that was the first time I directly talked about having a dissociative disorder and having a system. And after the training, a woman came up to me and said, I cannot believe, and she was complimentary about it. It was good stuff. It wasn't an insult, that a presenter at a public training was that upfront about her own dissociation. That's usually something that stays very hidden or very masked through, let me tell you about these cases of dissociation. And then I noticed, Tom, that the more and more I started dipping my toe out and then coming out more boldly, other therapists would approach me really with having me too type of conversations and saying things like, I've always been afraid to talk about this publicly because of the way that I'll be judged. And I think after my big article where I used the term dissociation phobia came out in 2018, that's when An Infinite Mind approached me. And they're a community that was founded by Jamie Pollock, who wrote the foreword for the book. She's a preschool teacher, now an administrator with herself a DID diagnosis. And she created the conference because she found there was a real gap in education, and that when she went to a couple mainline mental health conferences that were focused on dissociation, as a consumer, as a patient, she felt not welcome there. Like your presence isn't appropriate here. And she really wanted a conference where professionals and people with dissociative identities or dissociative struggles and their families and their partners can come and all get support in one place. And the first time I went to the conference, I was just blown away with this sense of this is how mental health conferences should be, that the us versus them barriers are taken down. And it was through that community that I've met even more therapists who identify as dissociative in one way or another. And I feel I have found my people, quote unquote, with them even more than I have in the rebel EMDR community, of which you and I are a part, because
Right.
it's not just that we're passionate about trauma work, but we're real passionate about, okay, let's break down the us versus them divide and let's start calling things as we see them.
Right. And I'm really interested in the identity, dissociative identity component, because I think people who identify right, as members of a class should recognize themselves in many of the major books. And if we think about it from an identity perspective, which is what's so exciting about this book, from an identity perspective, can we imagine a context with any identity in which the major books aren't written by a member of that identity class? It's kind of staggering to
I
some
I
degree.
yes, it is. I think of a quote from Melissa Parker, who is a therapist in Massachusetts. She's one of the contributors in the book who's out with her full name and is a therapist with DID. And when I asked her what made her want to come forward to be interviewed for the project, she said quite simply, our stories have been told by people who know nothing about us. And this is where, because sometimes, Tom, I could feel like, am I being too mouthy, too bratty with some of the things I say? And I'm realizing in this book, it's like, no, that there are other therapists like me who believe that. Melissa said this, and it's in the book. She says, there are therapists who practically have shrines in their offices to some of these major players in the field, Bessel van der Kolk. And said, in my experience, their understanding of dissociation is very poor. A lot of these quote unquote major players of the field, based on things she has heard them say at conferences, microaggressions that have been said, an exclusion of the dissociative experiences in their books or a glossing over. And so she is one who's very clear, like, I want to see a different arena of knowledge out there populated by people who are direct in their lived experience. And it's not to say that, and this is another area where it's like, yeah, am I being too much by saying this? But I'm going to say it. There are many people out there who write about dissociation and parts where my gut read on it is, yes, they do have lived experience in this, because guess what? We all do. But I feel like there is this professional masking under cases, under peer-reviewed literature, under models that, I would just take you a lot more seriously if you shared how you came up with this from your personal experience.
Right.
That's just my feeling.
And there are some people that we may be able to mention even locally that would kind of, have, I don't want to say a problem with this approach to dissociation, who I think between us at the end of that conversation, it would be, yeah, this person is pretty dissociated themselves. You know what I mean? And that's pretty unfortunate that this criticism may come from parts that they may be themselves pretty phobic of. So
something that I'm trying to figure out how to nicely word as a trauma therapist rant, which is at trauma therapist rants, is my new handle, TikTok and Instagram. So maybe I'll just talk it out here, that so many dissociation specialists in our field get that way because they are so dissociated from the totality of their experience. It is about this kind of extreme compartmentalization. And I recognize that. Area we get into in the book that I know is going to create a lot of noise is that a lot of us with dissociative identities, we make our judgment calls based on energetic read, like just knowing how comfortable, how safe we feel in your presence. And we can use, especially when we're in a more healed state, we can usually tell a mile away if you are masking, if you're dissociating yourself to try to keep it all together.
Right. I've also seen over the last few years this kind of evolution of you professionally kind of saying to hell with it. You know what I mean? and at each stage there are risks to that. Does that make sense? So in some level, I mean, there's also some benefits to that, because I think even among the professional organizations, it is 2022. And I think a lot of the recognition you've probably got has come from the vulnerability, that you've exhibited professionally, but from the different audiences of this book, because I think this book could be picked up by many new therapists, by many trauma therapists, by many family members who may want to support people who identify as having dissociative identities. It also may be picked up by certain type of other people who are going to want to know where your references are, for instance.
You were at that conference.
I was in that room.
Yes.
So, so I guess they're also, you know what I mean? They're also potential audiences for all of this. So, so how maybe a little bit of a vulnerable question, but how are your parts feeling about all of these potential
Yeah.
audiences?
That's fantastic. And I do directly take that on in the book that kind of a larger parts division that I disclose is this idea of Dr. Jamie and Jamie.
Yeah.
The parts that I talk about, my 4, 9, and 19-year-old parts, are definitely all a part of Jamie, Jamie the person. And Dr. Jamie is almost this alter ego we've all created to keep us protected. And she knows how to front, and she knows how to present us in a way that is more academic when we have
Mm-hmm.
to. And she's also the one who, like when we went through a horrible personal episode, like we have in the last week or so, is able to actually show up for work. So we all play our part in this symphony, if you will. And what I say in the book is that when I present, typically Dr. Jamie's the one who fronts, yet she's largely fueled by Jamie's experience. And so we try to present ourselves from that congruence. One of the presentations I did on this, I think it was the first time I spoke at an Infinite Mind. It was like Jamie would not let Dr. Jamie speak. It's like she tied her up in the trunk of the car and said, no, we're taking this one. So, thank you, but let us take this one. And I felt it was this disorganized, horrible jumble of a talk as well, but a lot of my friends who were there said, no, it was like you at your best. So trust that a little more. So in the book, I talk about how we're largely going to let Jamie take the lead on this one. That Dr. Jamie will insert herself a couple times where she feels you might need to listen to Jamie for professional credibility. So I think, my whole team got in a good place before writing this book about who was going to do what. And I referenced that conference that we were at in this book, like, where are your citations? Where's this? Where's that? And in the book, I do acknowledge all of that is important. And it's
Yeah,
been
yeah.
important to enhance the credibility of dissociation in the larger scientific community. But I also make the point other people have done that. So I'm not going to just try to do my version of it too. Here are the references, and I do provide some if you want to read more of the academic literature on dissociation. Where I feel I can be unique is offering not just lived experience, but how my lived experience has filtered some of that professional discourse too.
Okay, excellent. It's mentioned in the book, but it's not, obviously not the core of the book. But can you talk a little bit about addiction as dissociation model and your kind of work with Adam on
Yeah.
that in that area?
Yeah. Well, my personal, I would say my personal delving into that model happened when I was in graduate school, and my own dissociation was identified. I was first year working on my graduate internship. I was 2 years in sobriety from chemical addiction. And I noticed, fortunately, I had some awareness of this, but I had a coworker who was able to really point it out to me. I was dissociating significantly on the work site, at the work site. Uh, and I explained that it's largely not because of the way that it's not that the kids I was working with were triggering me, it was the way I saw systemic forces treating the kids. And it felt just something that was very familiar to me. So I knew, and this coworker helped me recognize, if you don't get this, I think, and I would never use these words now, but it's what he said then. If you don't get this dissociation thing under control, you're not going to last a minute in this field. And he was right in that my dissociation needed to be addressed in order for me to survive in this field. And when I started working with who would become my first EMDR therapist, who correctly identified my dissociative disorder and issues, it was so clear to me that after 2 years of sobriety, it was the perfect time for dissociation symptoms to flare up, because the chemicals were my dissociative device for so
Right.
many of those years. And so that was something that I long taught throughout my fledgling career, that in looking at the trauma addiction link, if we don't address people's trauma and dissociation after their abstinence, then they can be prone to relapse and all this. But then the more Adam and I started working together, it became very clear, what if we start talking about the manifestations of addictions or behavioral compulsions as the dissociation? And what our model essentially posits is that, and there's that word model. So please don't make a dogma, folks. You're free to add to this, discuss it, subtract to it. When a child growing up in complex trauma, especially, dissociates often enough, hard enough, long enough, which is a daily occurrence when you grow up in complex trauma, your brain in one way or another can become quite bonded to a dissociative state. And essentially, Adam would go as far as to say, we can get addicted or attached to the dissociation. It becomes our best friend. And then at some point, for a lot of us, it's in our preteens, early teens, a chemical is into the picture. With me, hell, it was probably food at age 5. When that chemical enters the picture, it accelerates our capacity to dissociate. It gets us there harder, further, faster. And then because of the biological factors we know are at play with addiction, that attachment can become even stronger. And I know for a lot of years, I would say dissociation wasn't an issue for me because I was drinking and using. But when I look at my life before that, when I look at my life after that, I'm kind of a lived experience case study for this quote unquote model.
Yes, good. Things get interesting when we lose the main drug of our coping.
Exactly.
Other things have to come in to show up to, yeah, okay, good. I am certain that we could do a whole weekend podcast and training on absolutely horrible media representations of dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that even though there are problems everywhere, right, with media representations of dissociation, are there some in the last few years that may be getting better?
I do, yes. And I'll give you this preview. I talk about Marvel's Moon Knight in the book. It came out right as I was finishing edits on it. So I was able to get in the Moon Knight section. And I wrote a blog about it at the time. And I tell this tale in the book that, and this is just a spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen it that may want to watch this. I adore the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I find that a lot of their stories are wonderful examples of archetypes that help people understand their parts world. And so when I saw Marvel was taking a lesser known superhero with, formerly split personalities and doing this dissociation tale, I was very fascinated by it. So of course I watched it, and I was incredibly moved by the way they showed the way his parts formed. Like, I thought that was right on the money. I get chills now even talking about it, as a response to his traumatic loss. And there's even a line in there where the parts are talking to each other and they recognize, you are the superpower. And that's something that a lot of our contributors say. But they still fall into this trope that dissociation equals violence because he's pegged to be an assassin. That his broken mind, his fractured mind, is seen as ideal to do the bidding of violent work. And I do talk in the book how, this could be how military recruiters operate too. Looking at some of the most broken children who are of recruitable age. And one of our contributors, who's an African-American veteran, talks about that in the book. But I wanted to like Moon Knight so badly. And it's like, no, it's still this assassin thing, this violent thing. So that's the biggest problem that I tend to see. Ryan Murphy's Ratchet did it as well, and I wrote a piece about that. I think it's an easy, cheap, dramatic device that gets used, especially when mental illness is being shown on screen. Are there better portrayals? There have been some documentaries or documentary series that have been surfacing, like I think her name is I Am Jane. I'm getting the title wrong. It's a Learning Channel documentary. But some of the criticism I've heard on that, which I think has been found, pretty well founded as well, is it shows the more dramatic sides of dissociation. There's a whole DID community on TikTok that the criticism there is what they tend to focus on, even as people with dissociative disorders, is the entertaining value of this, the switching, the character voices that a lot of people develop. And Jamie Pollock said, and I quote this in the book, people might be surprised to learn just how routine my life really is. That yes, it can come with its ups and downs and its dramas, and my life has certainly not been easy. But I think the biggest problem of media has been focusing on what is real entertainment value. And that's the point of media. I mean, let's be honest.
Right.
Yet I
Yeah.
do hope that more people who work in that have a greater call
Yeah.
to be responsible about what they're showing.
Right. And related to media, I really appreciated your recent video about the reframing of the whole TikTok thing as an opportunity. So do you mind resharing that? Even though if people look for it, they will find it online. But
Yes, so at Trauma Therapist Rants on TikTok, TikTok's been fun because, yeah, even as I was writing the book, one of the team members at my amazing publisher, North Atlantic Books, brought an article to me about is TikTok making DID a fad? And so I looked into it, and I looked into some of the users that they referenced at it. And Emily Christensen from the System Speaks podcast did a big piece about it in a peer journal as well. And yeah, I've had probably in the last year a good dozen therapists, many of whom are my friends or ICM team members, and just talking to me have said, what do we do with all these teenagers now who think they have DID from watching TikTok? A contributor for the book, who's an educator, texted me about it. She said, all the counselors at my school are asking me about this now. What do I tell them? And my thing is, if a kid sees content on TikTok about DID or any mental health issue, and they're like, yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me, you can honor your tendency to educate that not all manifestations of symptoms or signs are necessarily a problem. But even more than that, ask, what are you relating to? Help me understand what you're seeing in yourself in this individual who is presenting with DID. And I think it's a beautiful chance to normalize the idea that we all have parts of experience. And so I want to know, what are you relating to in this? And then from that, let's have a conversation about clinical threshold in a way a young person can understand it. And I don't think it's a concern. It's an opportunity to educate and explore.
right. Excellent. Good. And I kind of saw that coming up and I was like, oh no, I even have had my own kind of internal,
Yeah.
kind of thing about it. But, then we think, wait a minute, this is one of the things that we just know and your response is exactly the response that if what the focus was anxiety or depression or any other kind of identity issue, of course, right? But it's a really good example of our impulse to dismiss or to discount or to undermine or to not see it as a learning opportunity, but to push it away as though it's some kind of threat or devil or something.
Dirty word. It's a
Yes.
dirty word. There's a chapter in the book called Dissociation is Not a Dirty Word.
Yeah.
And I deliberately titled that way because it still has this negative connotation, even in the helping professions. And I really want to change that script.
Okay, good. I know that you talk to a lot of really, really interesting people, right? And I'm not asking you in this case to like get into any of the details, right? But if you could talk in a kind of top line version of one person and what that you interviewed in the book and what it is that they taught you that shifted how you were thinking about this whole project.
Yeah, that's a great question and hard to name just one because I think everyone in their own way taught me
Right.
something that changed me as a person, as a therapist. But as you were asking the question, the name that came up was the Garden System. And they are truly a system in that they're the one contributor who came forward who does not identify having a singular host or ANP, apparently normal part, as you might call in structural dissociation. that they are purely a garden, a collection of parts. And they have a legal name and a legal identity that they present as for work and now for school, yet they are truly a system. And it was interesting because they let me interview them and just got so much fascinating understanding about what it meant to really navigate life as a system, doing a lot of that fronting with the legal name and all of that. And but I think what touched me the most was after the book, the garden system emailed me and said, there's just one postscript to our interview we want to give. And that is, please tell therapists not to be afraid of littles, not to be afraid when young parts show up, because they said so many of the things we've read are really encouraging therapists to like not indulge that, to yes, we can honor them as parts, but they're not real people, quote unquote. And I remember when the garden system showed up on Zoom for their interview, one of their youngest, most vulnerable parts came out first and really needed to test the water to make sure that I was going to accept them. And then once that happened, I heard from all of them during the interview. And they said after the interview, the fact that you did that is why we felt okay to talk to you, because you accepted Jenny, this young part, and didn't like, because even that is the affect I would see so many therapists do if this adult person showed up as a very young person in a session. And I was very, when I did that during the interview, it just seemed very second nature to me to do. And it just touched me a lot that in their postscript, that was something they recognized as that's what more therapists need to do.
Which reminds me of that same Indriya presentation where a guy maybe in his 30s or so showed up and asked the question, what if a little child state shows up? And do you remember what your response was? Because I thought it was really...
I said, sir, do you have children?
Right.
Physical children that you
Yeah.
parent. He's like, yeah, I have, a couple little kids. And I said, what have you learned about children from talking to them? And then we just saw this look on his face where he's like, and he answered his own question.
Right. I know how to do this.
When it was framed this way, and I know not everybody's a parent, but
Yeah.
if you are a parent, a step parent, and an aunt, use that knowledge. It's valuable in how you talk to folks, the kind of language, how you regard. And it is a challenge because another element that came out in the book is with systems that have littles, there are some who really do want to be treated as I'm an adult who has child parts. So don't treat me like a kid. And that's something you can establish. Whereas the garden system, treating her that way would have been off-putting. So it was very much, you have to regard my young parts. And I think ultimately it comes down to the greatest skill of being a therapist is the relational value of gathering preference from people, asking what language feels better for you. And that's something we get into in the book. Some people don't like the word system. Some people don't like the word parts. So you can say, well, this is the language I kind of use, but does this language work for you? And then once you have a person either teach you the vocabulary they use, like another person in the book calls her parts defenders. And that language has always made perfect sense to her. A lot of people will call their system their team because that just sounds less like a car. It's what a contributor said. Call me system and it feels like I'm a car. Whereas the car is a metaphor that I use for myself. I feel like I'm a body bus or a body car. So yeah, let people teach you about them.
Excellent. And going through the book, that seems to be the point, which is that is a excellent starting point, is let your client educate you about how their system is, how their system works. One last question is, I know with Institute for Creative Mindfulness, one of the big teaching points is know your own system. And it's been somewhat of a struggle, even for people who are good therapists, to get their mind around what it is, like what's the advantage of me as a therapist, as a human being, getting in touch with my system. And I don't know if you have a kind of a response to that, or a way to kind of let people see that this work is about the work of being human. You know what I mean? This is about. Um,
Well, I go down that to your own sharing in the book,
right.
right? Lesson, and you could read the book, folks, and hear a little
Yeah.
more story. But I was another big line that touched me was, what that priest told you about you
Yeah.
were to be human. There's
Right.
no shame in that, and it still breaks my heart how many therapists I encounter who are ashamed of their own humanity or their own fallibility, their own faults. And I think it's so hammered into us during
Mm-hmm.
training. To look like you have your shit together,
Yeah.
because
But
that's
shame's driving the bus everywhere you look.
yes, most definitely. So I don't know, because some people who come in and hear me teach this are very open to doing the work. Some people have a moderate curiosity, and I think even there I would meet that with, is there a part of you who knows you need to do this and a part of you that's scared of doing
Yeah.
this? And can we engage in a little like two-handed interweave on that, which is a technique of Robin Shapiro to kind of like
Right.
how these forces are. And I think if the idea of parts scares you, I would encourage people to look at your various roles in life. Because even if you took a sociology 101 course, you were taught that we all carry many different roles at one time. Being a parent, a son, a therapist, professional, a teacher. And I think about even what that can teach me if I didn't have as good of knowledge of my part system. So I would encourage people to maybe start there. And sometimes how I have to encourage it is it'll help you better understand your clients. But
Yeah.
if that helps you do the work for you, then cool.
Right. Good. And one of the big take homes of the book for me is that, really exploring parts is no more difficult than pretending that you're not already working with a system. You know what I mean? And there's really great harm that can come from pretending that you're not working with a system.
Right.
Yeah.
And if it's helpful for you to start by thinking of it as the whole, oh, body, mind, and spirit thing that
Right.
we tend to all like to give the lip service to, or at least body mind if you're not wanting to address spirit,
Yeah.
then let's start with where you can. So great questions, Tom. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on this
I
first
mean,
expert. Thank you. Thank you for joining, and thank you again for everything that you have been to me personally, professionally, and thank you for advancing the conversation um, really from the inside. So thanks a lot.
you're most welcome, Tom, and thanks for accepting the invitation to go
Okay.
there.
Thank you.